She boarded a 12-hour flight, then realized the man beside her was her billionaire ex, and she was carrying his twins. The hum of the engines filled the cabin like a heartbeat trapped in metal. Somewhere over the Atlantic, seat 14 trembled. Tiara Rivers clenched the armrest as the plane jolted again. Outside, the night pressed thick against the window, city lights long gone beneath the clouds. Her breath came slow, measured. Across from her, the man she hadn't seen in 2 years adjusted his cufflinks, with calm precision, the same hands that once knew every contour of her back. His name was Dorian Voss, the billionaire every business magazine called untouchable, the man she once loved when he still wore hope like an open shirt. Now, every movement of his was controlled, rehearsed, like even gravity answered to him. Tiara looked down at her trembling hands. The secret she'd carried for months sat heavy in her chest, fighting for air. She had sworn she would never say it. Not to him. Not like this. But the turbulence shook more than the plane. It shook her resolve. The seatbelt light blinked on. She turned toward him. "I'm pregnant." His eyes flicked up, unreadable. For a second, neither spoke. The air between them buzzed, sharp as static. Then she added, quietly, "There are 2. The engines roared beneath the silence that followed. Dorian's hand froze mid-air. For the first time in years, his control cracked. 12 hours trapped above the clouds, and fate decided to put her right next to the man she'd sworn off forever. No escape, no signal, no more pretending that what they had was finished. Every beat of turbulence reminded her, some truths demand altitude to surface. To our first 600+ subscribers, y'all are the heartbeat of Mr. Steele Rich Stories. If you're new, join the family, subscribe, hit the bell, and comment 600 so I can shout you out next drop. Have you ever been forced to face what you ran from? Sat so close to the very person you tried to erase that you could feel their silence breathing beside you? Tiara did. She spent months avoiding his world, building a quiet life where no one asked questions. She thought she could stay invisible, until one boarding call changed everything. Now here she was, 30,000 feet above regret, holding the kind of secret that changes lives forever. 2 lives to be exact, Mira and Kai. Dorian wasn't a man who lost composure. His empire stretched across continents. Every deal, every merger. Precise, strategic, ruthless. But this was not in any contract he'd ever signed. Tiara could feel his gaze tracing her face, searching for the truth behind her words. He'd always been that way, studying, analyzing, peeling back layers without mercy. He leaned back slowly. "Say it again," he murmured. She hesitated. "I said I'm pregnant, Dorian, with twins." Her throat tightened around the words. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his jaw flexed, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "How long have you known?" "Since the morning I saw your name on that billboard," she replied. It felt like the universe was laughing. He exhaled hard, the sound barely audible over the hum of the engines. The attendant rolled past with drinks, unaware that the quietest war on the planet had just begun in row 14. The flight stretched ahead like an emotional hostage situation. Every few minutes, another jolt of turbulence rippled through the cabin, forcing their shoulders to brush. Each touch burned. Each glance reopened something old and unfinished. Tiara tried to focus on the safety card in front of her, but her vision blurred. Her chest ached with the weight of everything unsaid. Dorian broke the silence. "Were you ever going to tell me?" She turned toward him. "I didn't think you'd care." He laughed once, low, bitter. "You think I wouldn't care about my own children?" "Children you never wanted," she fired back. "You made that clear when you chose your company over us." He stared out the window, jaw tight. "You don't know what that choice cost me." Her eyes softened. "Then tell me, will he finally be brave out loud? Will she let him back in long enough to hear the truth, all of it? Or will the plane land, and both pretend this never happened, while the world below waits to expose them? Because when a billionaire's private life meets a headline, the fallout is never small. And somewhere, In the belly of this flight sat a journalist with a hidden camera, ready to sell the next scandal before the seatbelt sign even turned off. The storm outside thickened. Lightning flashed faintly through the clouds. Chiara gripped her seat, knuckles pale. Dorian reached out instinctively, covering her hand with his. She froze. That single touch dragged her back to the night she left him, barefoot, shaking, holding a broken promise and the test she never showed him. Now, sitting here, she could feel the echo of that night between them. He didn't let go. "Chiara," he said quietly, "I know I failed you. I thought building an empire would fix everything. I thought time would make you understand." She met his eyes. Understand what? That love isn't scalable. He almost smiled, the kind of smile that I remembered. "You still talk like that, and you still avoid saying sorry," she said quietly. He looked away. The city lights of another time zone glimmered faintly below. "Do they know about me?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not yet. They don't even know my name means river." I wanted to give them peace before they got questions. Dorian leaned back, processing. Peace without truth doesn't last long. Her lips parted, but no words came. The seatbelt sign flickered again. The plane shuddered harder this time. A child cried a few rows ahead. Chiara gasped, grabbing the armrest again. Dorian instinctively pulled her closer, steadying her against his chest. "Easy," he whispered. "You're safe." She stayed still for a second too long. His cologne, the one she once picked out, filled her lungs. Memories collided like lightning. She pulled away slowly. "You shouldn't." "I know," he said softly. "But I can't sit here and do nothing while you shake." Her voice cracked. "Then why did you let me go when I begged you to fight for us?" He didn't answer. The storm subsided outside, but their silence didn't. Hours passed. One movie, 2 meals, and countless glances later, dawn began to tint the clouds pale gold. Chiara hadn't slept. Dorian hadn't stopped thinking. He finally turned to her again. "Chiara, when we land, I want a chance to do this right." Her brow furrowed. "Do what is right." "Us," he said simply. "Them," she sighed. "You think it's that easy?" "No," he replied. "But I think it's possible." She looked out the window, tears forming again. "You're good at rebuilding things, Dorian, just not people." He didn't flinch. "Then let me start learning." He turned to her one last time before she reached for her earbuds. "Chiara," he said softly, "I never stopped wanting a future with you. I was just too afraid to admit it out loud." She blinked slowly, voice trembling. "Then be brave now." He nodded. "Starting with this flight." As their eyes met again, the captain's voice echoed overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. 12 hours of altitude, 12 hours of truth." But the story wasn't over. It was just hitting ground level. To our first 600+ subscribers, y'all are the heartbeat of Mr. Steele Rich Stories. If you're new, join the family, subscribe, hit the bell, and comment and 600 strong so I can shout you out next drop. This isn't where they started, but it's where everything finally stops pretending. Chiara Rivers wasn't just a muralist. She was a painter of life. In the dusty, forgotten corners of her city, she found color in places most people overlooked. Walls that had long been ignored were her canvases. Faded schools, run down community centers, orphanages that hadn't seen, a coat of paint in decades. They all came alive under her steady hands. Her true mission, though, wasn't about creating art for art's sake. It was about giving color a place in the world, even where the world seemed to have none. She built community arts programs from the ground up, quietly transforming neglected spaces into vibrant hubs of creativity. Her work wasn't just paint, it was an invitation to dream, to believe, to create. Chiara's core desire had always been clear, to make color a birthright in underfunded schools. She wanted every child, regardless of where they came from, to experience the transformative power of art, to see their own potential reflected in the strokes of a brush. A simple mural could change the way a child saw their world. And that belief drove everything she did. She wasn't a dreamer. She was a doer. Her hands were steady, never shaking when she held a paintbrush. But when it came to matters of the heart, her steadiness faltered, especially when it came to Dorian Voss. Dorian Voss was a man built of contradictions. On the outside, he was everything the world expected of a billionaire CEO. Immaculately dressed, perfectly poised, his life a public spectacle of power, wealth, and influence. But beneath the polished exterior, there was something more, something real. Dorian knew the difference between money and meaning. He was generous, not because he had to be, but because he understood that his fortune didn't belong to him alone. It was a means to an end, a tool to make the world better, if only a little. Every charity he funded, every cause he supported, wasn't for his image. It was for a world that needed change, a world he couldn't ignore. But generosity had its limits. He knew that. And when it came to his personal life, he was careful. The machine around him, the media, the investors, the endless contracts, made him hesitate. The line between his public persona and private reality was as carefully constructed as any business deal. But, somewhere beneath that fortress of perfection, was a man who had loved deeply and lost even deeper. And that loss, Ciara, was a wound he had never fully healed. Ciara and Dorian's first meeting wasn't grand. There were no fireworks, no dramatic speeches. It was at a greenhouse gala, one of those exclusive events where everything shimmered in gold and glass. The air was thick with the smell of flowers and fresh-cut grass. Guests mingled in silks and suits, their voices a buzz of polite chatter. Dorian had been standing by himself, as always, observing, but never fully engaging. He had been to hundreds of these events, and yet he always felt like an outsider. And then he saw her. Ciara was in the corner, her dress simple but elegant, a quiet elegance that drew his eye. She wasn't interested in the glitter of the gala or the shallow conversations. Instead, she was talking to a small group of volunteers, organizing a silent auction to raise money for underfunded schools. She was focused, her passion apparent in every word she spoke. Dorian didn't walk up to her. He watched, and when their eyes met across the room, something shifted. He felt it. She did too. Later that evening, they found themselves at a table with coffee, exchanging stories about the world they wanted to change. He spoke of business, she of art. They listened, they shared, and as the night wore on, they walked through the gardens side by side. There were no promises made, no future spoken of, but when they reached the river walk, with the cool night air around them and the city, lights reflecting off the water, it felt like the beginning of something inevitable. In the weeks that followed, they spent hours in each other's company. Simple, quiet moments. A dinner at a modest bistro, a walk through the park, even an afternoon spent in her family kitchen, where the smell of dishwater and fresh oranges filled the air as they laughed, argued, and worked together on community projects. It was then that Dorian realized that he could be himself around her, not the billionaire, not the CEO, just a man who wanted to make a difference. Ciara, in turn, began to understand him in ways he hadn't expected. She saw beyond wealth and power. She saw the man who still carried the weight of his past, the man who had learned to protect himself behind walls he had built around his heart. And in those small moments, she began to love him, a love that felt like home. But as often happens with things that feel too good to be true, cracks began to show. It started with a rumor, one of those whispers that had no substance but seemed to grow with each telling. A story about Dorian. A story about betrayal. It was enough to fuel the flames of gossip, to stir the press into a frenzy. Dorian had always been careful with his public image, always calculated with the way he presented himself to the world. But the rumor was more than just damaging. It was a threat to everything he had worked for, everything he had built. His PR team swung into action, building the usual fortress around him, denying, distracting, protecting. And then, Ciara's truth collided with his image. Her love for him wasn't a headline. It wasn't something to be spun for profit. She wanted honesty, transparency, and the kind of love that didn't come with an agenda. But Dorian was trapped in the machine. his public life pulling him in one direction, while his heart tugged him in another. Her frustration grew. She needed to believe in something more than just the words he said. She needed action, not optics. She needed him to choose her, to choose them, their love, their future. In the silence of their apartment, surrounded by unfinished plans and empty promises, Ciara left him. She left a key on the kitchen counter, a key he never used, never came back for, and now, as they sat thousands of feet in the air, the stakes had never been higher. Ciara was pregnant with twins, Mira and Kai, 2 lives that would require more than just wealth. They would need stability, they would need truth, they would need love. Dorian knew what was at stake. He had seen the man he had become, and it wasn't the man Ciara deserved. But he also knew that he could never be the man he once was, the man who could have fought for her. Ciara wanted steady, not grand. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his fame. She needed his heart. But Dorian had built an empire on being grand, on living large, on making sure every detail was polished and perfect. How could he reconcile that with the quiet, grounded love Ciara wanted? The question was no longer about who was right or wrong. It was about who he would be in the end. The man who had everything and nothing, or the man who could finally step out of his fortress and choose love over image? At this moment, Dorian understood something fundamental: pride. The pride that kept him safe behind his empire. The pride that had caused him to turn away from Ciara, protected his image. It protected his position in the world. But humility? Humility protected his relationships. It protected the love he'd let slip through his fingers. Could he find the humility to choose love over pride? And then, the airline did what fate sometimes does. It assigned the pass to 14A and 14 billions. The overhead lights flickered on, a soft hum filling the cabin as passengers trickled toward their seats. Ciara's gaze was fixed on the window as she sat in 14A, the dim lighting casting shadows on her face. The plane was quiet for the moment, save for the distant sounds of luggage being stowed, the soft murmur of voices in the aisle, and the subtle click of seatbelt buckles. Her hand rested lightly on her belly, the weight of the secret pressing harder now. She could feel the flutter of Mira and Kai, the life she hadn't planned, the life she hadn't been ready to share with him. The seat beside her remained empty, and she focused on the distant horizon outside, imagining the miles that stretched between them and everything she had left behind. The scent of cedar from the polished wood inside the plane mixed with the faint scent of fresh linen. It was all so clinical, so perfect. And yet, the air around her felt thick with unsaid things, words she hadn't spoken, feelings she hadn't shared. The door to the cabin slid shut, and then he appeared. Dorian Voss. He moved through the aisle with that same measured confidence, his eyes briefly scanning the seats before he found her. There was no shock in his gaze, no recognition that this was where fate had brought them. He knew. He'd seen her name on the boarding pass. And yet, despite the distance of 2 years, he still moved toward her, as if there was no question, as if the space between them had already been filled, and now the only thing left was to close it. He didn't speak as he slid into the seat next to her. His presence filled the space, but he kept a careful distance, like he was waiting for her to make the first move. "Dorian," she said, her voice a touch too soft, the air around them thick with unspoken words. He nodded once, offering a tight smile. "Ciara." His voice was low, careful. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to be the man who returned her smile or the man who waited for her to pull away again. They sat in silence for a moment. She stared out the window, and he stared at her profile, watching her as if she were a ghost he couldn't quite touch. "I didn't think you'd be here," she said after a while, her hands still resting on her stomach, the subtle curve beneath her clothing betraying the secret they shared. "Neither did I," Dorian replied, his voice flat. "But here we are." Another beat of silence stretched between them. His eyes flicked to the seatbelt sign above them, then back to her hand, and finally to her eyes. His gaze lingered there, but he didn't speak again. The tension between them hung like a thick fog. Ciara's thoughts flashed back, memories rushing in like the tide. Her mother's kitchen, warm and alive with the hum of family, the clatter of dishes, and the smell of fresh-baked bread. She had been young then, eager to make her mark in the world, to prove she could do something on her own. Dorian's voice echoed in her mind, as clear as it had been all those years ago. "This is the way forward, Ciara. The press will eat it up. We can build something from this, together." His sleeves had been rolled up, his jaw tight as he signed the papers, the contract that would make their relationship public, the agreement she couldn't bring herself to accept. It was all so easy for him, everything wrapped up in business, in PR, in optics. But for her, it was never that simple. The truth was never so clean. She hadn't signed. And in the end, it wasn't just the papers she walked away from. The nausea hit her in waves, a twisting pressure that made her stomach tighten. It wasn't just the pregnancy, though. It was the weight of everything unsaid, the fear that hung like a shadow in the back of her mind. Fear of telling him, of letting him into the space she had fought so hard to protect. Fear of not telling him, of keeping the truth buried, of letting him think he could just glide through life as if nothing had changed. Her hand drifted to her stomach again, her fingers brushing the soft curve beneath her shirt, and Dorian noticed. His gaze shifted to her hand, lingering for just a second longer than necessary before moving back up to her face. He said nothing, but there was a question in his eyes, one he wasn't ready to ask yet. Ciara glanced at him quickly, but his expression was guarded. He was careful, as always, but she could feel the question in the air between them, thick and pressing. Would she tell him now, or would she stay silent like she always did? The tension between them was a quiet hum, the kind that only got louder the longer you ignored it. She finally broke the silence, her voice steady but cold. "Headed away," she said, her eyes turning back to the window. Honolulu. Big walls, bigger stories. Dorian's brow furrowed, and for the first time he spoke with something deeper than the calculated politeness he had been offering. "Honolulu?" His voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. She nodded, her gaze still fixed outside. "I run community art programs there. They need help rebuilding. A few schools, a few local programs. I'm not interested in anything grand. Just steady, consistent change." He leaned back slightly, considering her words. "You make space for people to be seen," he said, his voice soft but clear. "That's what you do. That's always been your way." Her heart skipped, her chest tightening as his words hit home. There was something in the way he said it, something that felt like understanding. The walls she had built around her heart, around her work, had always been there to keep him out. But now, in his presence, they seemed less important, less needed. The plane shuddered again, just a light ripple of turbulence, but it was enough to jolt them both. The subtle motion of the cabin mirrored the shift between them. Dorian's hand, which had been resting on his knee, slowly drifted closer to hers. It hovered for a moment, as if he were unsure whether to make the move or stay back. Ciara felt her breath catch in her throat. She had felt the weight of his gaze on her, the tension that had been building between them for hours. But this was different. It wasn't just the weight of the past between them, it was the present, the future, everything they hadn't said yet. His hand was inches away from hers now, the soft hum of the plane filling the silence. She didn't move, neither did he. For a moment, it felt like the entire world was suspended in time. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Dorian's hand drifted back to his lap, and Ciara looked away, her heart pounding in her chest. The turbulence settled, but the tension didn't. It hung between them, heavy, like an unanswered question that neither of them could escape. The fortress taught him to be quiet. Love taught him to ask. The plane shook again, this time more violently. The light above them flickered briefly before settling into a steady hum. It felt like the plane was fighting against the winds outside, just as she was fighting against the turbulence inside her. Ciara's grip on the armrest tightened. Her knuckles turned white. Her stomach twisted in knots as another jolt ran through the cabin. She had been bracing for this moment for years, the moment she would face Dorian again. She hadn't expected it to be like this. The pressure of his presence beside her felt like the weight of the storm itself. Dorian's hand, steady as ever, reached across the seat. He didn't ask, didn't hesitate. His thumb gently pressed against the spot on her wrist where her pulse beat wildly. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a touch of reassurance. It was a small gesture, something he had done in the past. Something they had shared in a lifetime that felt like another world. The familiar gesture grounded her, reminded her of the man she had once known, the man who had once made her feel safe. But that was before the walls went up, before the promises were broken. Now, it was a touch that both comforted and haunted her. It was like looking at an old map. The landmarks were still there, the roads familiar, but the journey felt different this time. It wasn't the same road they had once traveled together, not anymore. She didn't pull away from his touch. She didn't push him back either. Instead, she allowed herself a single moment to breathe through the turbulence. It wasn't just the plane rocking against the storm, it was everything they hadn't said. The words hung in the air, waiting for the right time, the right moment. The plane steadied, the turbulence easing as the storm passed. For a long while, they sat in silence. But then, in that quiet space between the storm and the calm, Dorian spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough but sincere. The words didn't come with the polish he was used to in public speeches. Nor did they carry the weight of a man who had practiced his apology. They were just words, honest and plain. Chiara turned to him, meeting his eyes. Sorry. She wasn't angry, not anymore. But the hurt, the long-buried hurt, was still there, lingering in her chest. Sorry for what? Dorian let out a slow breath, his hands still resting near hers. He didn't move it away. I made you feel like a strategy, like something I could manage or fix. His eyes softened, and there was a flicker of something raw in his gaze. I didn't choose us out loud, Ciara. I let the world tell me who I should be. I let the pressure take over. His voice trailed off, and for the first time in years, Ciara saw something unguarded in him. She saw the man who had been caught between his ambition and his heart, the man who had never learned how to balance the two. She took a deep breath, trying to process his words. He had been trying to explain himself for years in a way she had always known this apology was coming. But now, hearing it from him at this moment, it didn't feel like enough. Still, it was a step in the right direction. Ciara swallowed hard, her voice shaky as she finally allowed herself to speak the words she had kept hidden for so long. I wasn't asking you to burn down your life, Dorian, she said quietly, looking away. I was asking you to see mine. Her words hung in the air between them, the weight of everything she had carried alone settling on her shoulders. She had never asked him to give up everything he had worked for, to sacrifice his empire. She had only asked for him to acknowledge the life she was building, the life they had built, even if it had seemed small compared to everything he had. You never really saw me, did you? She whispered, her throat tight. You never saw who I was, what I wanted. You saw a project, a challenge. And when it became hard, you turned away. Dorian opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, all that filled the space between them was the thrum of the plane's engines and the beat of their hearts, both unsteady, both unsure. Ciara couldn't look at him anymore. She couldn't let herself believe that the words he had spoken were enough. It wasn't about apologies. It was about the choices they had made, the ones that had led them here. And yet, as her hand rested on her belly again, she knew that some things were more important than what had come before. Ciara exhaled, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't ready to say it. But the moment had arrived. I'm pregnant. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but the words seemed to fill the space around them, heavy and undeniable. Dorian froze. His gaze snapped to her, his expression hardening, his chest tightening with the shock of her words. For a moment, the world seemed to stop moving. There was no sound, no turbulence, just the pounding of her heart in her ears. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, his mouth opened slightly as if he was trying to process the words, to make sense of the reality she had just dropped into his lap. Are you, and they, okay? His voice cracked slightly, his eyes flicking to her stomach, to the life that was growing inside of her. His guard had cracked, and wonder, pure, unfiltered wonder, flooded his face. Tiara felt her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't expected this reaction. She hadn't expected him to care. At least not like this. Not with the same depth that mirrored her own concern. "I'm fine," she said softly, her hand gently resting on her stomach again. "And they're fine. But I've been alone in this, Dorian. You haven't been here. Not for me, not for them. If you were in her seat, would you tell him mid-flight or wait until landing?" The question hung in the air, another decision that Tiara couldn't make for herself. Comment, "Tell now," or "Wait. I'm reading every take." If this moment has you locked in, drop a like so more people find stories with heart. Dorian's eyes softened, the last of his walls crumbling. He didn't hesitate this time. His voice was quiet, sincere. "I'll be there." "Slow and honest," he said, his words not as polished as before, but real, grounded in something he had never let himself feel. "I'm not asking you to trust me right now. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove I can do better. I'll be there. For you, and for them. Steady like you asked." Tiara's heart fluttered painfully in her chest. She didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need him to promise the world. She just needed him to show up, to be present, to be the man she had always believed he could be. "You'll have him," Dorian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. All of me." For the first time in years, Tiara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more. Something steady, something real. 12 hours to Honolulu. 1 hour to decide who they'll be when wheels touch Earth. The plane's descent was smooth, the engines humming low as the lights of Honolulu's coastline flickered into view. Tiara stared out the window, watching the island grow closer with every passing second. She could feel her heart beating in time with the plane's descent, the anticipation and tension in the pit of her stomach rising. The warm air hit her face the moment they stepped off the plane. It wasn't just the tropical heat. It was the feeling of being somewhere, new, somewhere away from the world they had both left behind. She inhaled deeply, the scent of the ocean filling her lungs. Dorian was silent as they walked through the terminal. He hadn't tried to fill the space with empty chatter, hadn't pushed. The months of silence between them had created a new dynamic, one that neither of them could ignore. He was here, but he didn't force himself into her day. As they reached the baggage claim, he paused and turned toward her. His voice was calm, measured, but it held something more, a softness. That was beginning to slip through the cracks of the man he had been. "Can I meet you at the clinic?" he asked, his hands tucked casually in his pockets. "As close as you want, as far as you need." Tiara glanced at him, surprised at the lack of urgency in his request. There was no expectation, no demand, just a simple offer. It felt right, and she wasn't sure why. She had spent so long running from him, from this situation, but there was something about him, something about the way he said it, that made her believe he was here to stay. Not as a billionaire CEO, not as someone who could fix things with money, but as the man who might finally choose her. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. She hadn't expected to answer so quickly, but the word slipped out before she could stop it. Close. The word surprised her even more than it did him. She had expected herself to push him away again, to put distance between them. But the truth was, she wanted him there. She wanted him close. Dorian's eyes softened at her response. He didn't ask her to elaborate, didn't push for more. He simply nodded, accepting her answer without question. The clinic was calm and quiet, the soft hum of the fish tank filling the silence as they walked through the doors. The walls were painted in gentle blues and greens, the scent of antiseptic mingling with the calmness of the space. Tiara checked in at the front desk, her hands instinctively reaching for the little notebook she carried, scribbling down notes as she always did. Dorian stood back, a respectful distance away, observing her, giving her the space she needed. It wasn't lost on her how different he was now, how he seemed to understand the importance of boundaries. The Dorian she had known would have stepped forward, made his presence known, taken charge of the situation. But now, he simply waited, letting her move through the process at her pace. After a few minutes, the nurse called them in, and Ciara led the way down the hallway. Dorian followed quietly behind her, his footsteps matching hers, a silent understanding between them. Inside the ultrasound room, the fluorescent lights hummed softly. The technician was efficient but kind, moving through the motions of the procedure. Dorian remained by the door, his hands in his pockets, but his eyes never leaving Ciara. As the technician prepared the ultrasound, Dorian finally spoke, his voice quiet, but full of something that hadn't been there before. "Anything I should say or not say?" he asked, his humility almost startling. He wasn't asking to take charge. He wasn't asking to fix things. He was simply trying to be there for her, in whatever way she needed. Ciara looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in a long while. There was no shield in his eyes now, no carefully constructed mask. There was just the man who had once loved her, who still seemed to care in his own quiet way. "Just be yourself," she replied softly. "That's all you need to do." The technician glanced up from the screen, giving them both a reassuring smile. "Ready?" she asked. Ciara nodded, her heart beating faster as the sound of the ultrasound began to fill the room. The first beat of the twins' heart echoed softly, and Ciara's chest tightened. The technician moved the wand slightly, and then there was another beat, faster, stronger. 2 heartbeats. Dorian's breath caught in his throat. He moved closer to Ciara, standing just behind her. His eyes were wide, his expression filled with wonder. "2?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ciara smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Mira and Kai." The names felt like a prayer, a promise for something better, something that was already growing inside her. Dorian's hand trembled slightly as he reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "They're beautiful," he murmured. His voice was raw, his guard completely gone now. "You're—" She turned slightly, catching the vulnerability in his eyes. "We're fine, Dorian. All of us." The room felt small, the sound of their breathing filling the space between them as the technician left, giving them a moment of privacy. Dorian's hand rested gently on the back of Ciara's chair, his touch light but firm, like a promise that he was here, truly here. "I'll help," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "I'll help with everything, but I don't want any announcements, no optics, no media circus. We'll keep it simple, non-profit contributions only. We'll keep the rest to ourselves." Ciara blinked, surprised by the weight of his words. This was the Dorian she had always wanted to see, not the billionaire trying to control every situation, but the man who was willing to sacrifice everything he had built to do the right thing. "No optics," she repeated, her voice a little shaky. "Just steady, steady," he agreed softly. "I'll be steady, Ciara. For you, for them." They didn't need a grand plan. They didn't need a flashy announcement. They needed a quiet life, one where they could protect the things that mattered most. Dorian smiled, his hand moving to the sleeve of his jacket. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something simple, a folded napkin with a sketch on it. Ciara's heart skipped as he handed it to her. The sketch was one she had made for him, years ago, a simple design she had drawn on a napkin during one of their late-night talks. It was a river, winding and steady, just like the life she had dreamed of for them. "I never let it go," Dorian said quietly, his eyes locked on hers. As they left the clinic, the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft glow over the city. Dorian draped a cedar hoodie over her shoulders, the fabric soft and familiar. She looked at him in surprise, but he didn't say anything. There was no need. His actions spoke louder than words. In her hand, she held the sonogram printout, a tangible piece of their future. The quiet, steady image of Mira and Kai. 2 heartbeats, strong and steady. As they walked together, side by side, Dorian reached into his pocket and pulled out the napkin sketch again, folding it carefully and placing it in her hand. "I never stopped believing in what we could be," he said softly. "Even when I wasn't sure how to make it right. The headline would write itself. They chose a quieter story, slow and honest. The mornings in Honolulu were slow, the sun peeking over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the ocean. Dorian and Ciara woke early before the tourists crowded the beaches. They walked along the sand, the sound of the waves mixing with the gentle whisper of the wind. There was nothing glamorous about it. No photographers, no headlines, no grand gestures. Just the two of them, side by side, moving in rhythm with the world around them. Dorian, always slightly ahead, his stride long and confident, while Ciara kept pace beside him, steady and calm. The simplicity of it all made her heart ache. It was what she had wanted all along. Peace. A life free from the noise and the drama of the world they had both come from. They didn't need the crowds. They didn't need the press. Just this. Back at the house, the mornings were filled with small, quiet moments. Ciara would make toast, spreading it too thin with butter, too thick with jam. The lemon in her tea was never quite right, but she added it anyway. They never seemed to get the balance of their breakfast just perfect, but it didn't matter. It was theirs. Later, they would try swaddling a stuffed animal, Dorian fumbling with the blanket, struggling to fold it just right. The burrito fail was a particularly hilarious moment, and they both laughed at his clumsy attempts, his pride taking a back seat to the humor of the situation. These were the moments of intimacy that they built, bit by bit, not in grand gestures, but in the everyday acts of being with each other. Laughter echoed through the community center they had been working with, a space where children's drawings lined the walls, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the steel gray of the world outside. Ciara would often leave Dorian to his phone calls and meetings, diving into the projects that mattered to her. She felt his presence behind her, quiet but steady, as she continued to pour herself into the work. And when the day ended, they would share a quiet dinner, nothing fancy, just the two of them and the peace that came with it. The intimacy in the ordinary acts. This was their love now. It was a Tuesday, and the routine was beginning to settle in. They had learned how to live without the world intruding, without the noise of the outside world creeping in. That was, until her phone buzzed with a message, then another, and another. Ciara glanced down at the screen, her pulse quickening. The first message was from a friend, a warning, but the next few came from strangers, and the last from her sister. A blurry photo, taken outside the clinic the day before, had gone semi-viral. It was grainy but unmistakable, Dorian's hand resting on her shoulder as they left the building together. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get the wheels turning, enough to send the press into a frenzy. Ciara closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. She didn't want this. She didn't want the world to see them. Not like this, not before they were ready. Dorian, who had been standing by the window, heard the buzz of her phone and turned toward her. She didn't need to say anything. He could see the look in her eyes. He knew. Without a word, he moved toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He reached out, taking her phone gently from her hands, turning the screen face down. His touch was soft, deliberate. There was no rush in him, no need to fill the space with meaningless words. "We don't feed it," he said quietly. "We stay with what's true." His words were simple, but they settled over her like a quiet comfort. They had both known this moment would come. They had both known that the world wouldn't leave them in peace forever. But he was right. They couldn't let the world control them. Ciara nodded, a small, weary smile tugging at her lips. "Stay with what's true," she echoed. The pressure of the outside world pressed against them, but it wasn't enough to break the rhythm they had built together. Not yet. The following days were filled with the kind of quiet decisions that now shaped their lives. The board was calling. They wanted Dorian on a plane mid-week, but he wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Ciara watched him from the kitchen as he paced the room, phone pressed to his ear. The conversation was brief, polite, and businesslike. The words were all the same, but the meaning had changed. "Remote attendance," Dorian said with quiet authority, the decision made without hesitation. "I'll join the meeting from here." He hung up the phone, a calm settling over him. He had made his choice. There would be no more jetting off for business, no more putting work first. Not this time. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the last light of day fade over the horizon, Dorian turned to her. "I said no," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "No to the trip. No to the pressure. No to pretending that I need to be in two places at once." Kiara felt a warmth in her chest. She had known this decision was coming, but hearing it from him, hearing him put her and their future first, felt like a gift. It wasn't grand, it wasn't flashy, but it was real, and it was exactly what they needed. A few days later, Dorian made another quiet decision. The donation he had promised to the local non-profit wasn't going to come with any fanfare, any grand reveal. There would be no plaque, no photo ops. It was simple, silent support. Kiara had expected something like this, but she hadn't expected how it would feel. How his actions, though small in the eyes of the world, felt monumental to her. She watched as he wrote the check, as he sealed it in an envelope and handed it over to the non-profit's representative. There was no press conference, no cameras, just a quiet moment in the back of a community center where Dorian's contribution would help support the arts programs that meant so much to her. It wasn't about the money. It was about the quiet promise of being there, truly there, in the way that mattered. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch, Dorian pulled out a spiral notebook. It was old, worn, the edges of the pages curling slightly. He scribbled down a few dates, a few notes, and then he looked at her. "This," he said, holding up the notebook, "this is our plan, not a cage, a compass." Chiara smiled, her heart lifting at the simplicity of his words. The schedule wasn't filled with board meetings or international flights. It was filled with small moments, appointments, routines, and time for them. Time for the things that mattered. "We'll stick this on the fridge," Dorian said, as he tore out the page and stuck it to the door. "A reminder that we're in this together." Steady, she kissed him softly, her hand brushing over the notes he had written. The plan was simple. It wasn't glamorous, but it was what they needed. Quick check-in. If your partner was under public pressure, what boundary would matter most to you? Comment, time, privacy, or presence. If this moment has you locked in, drop a like so more people find stories with heart. Love doesn't avoid storms. It learns how to hold hands in the rain. The days following the decision to keep their lives quieter, away from the scrutiny of the world, settled into a rhythm. Mornings in Honolulu were gentle. The island bathed in the soft hues of dawn. The air was thick with salt and promise, and every step Sierra took was purposeful. She stood tall on the scaffolding, brush in hand, watching the mural she had designed come to life. It was an evolving masterpiece of color, birds soaring, threads intertwining, a river winding through, symbolizing the journey they had taken together, yet apart. It was more than a piece of art. It was a story, a map. The community that stood behind it was etched into every stroke, every layer of paint. It was a part of her soul, a gift to the world she had been carving out, quietly, without fanfare. Dorian stood below, steady as always. The soft echo of the brush against the canvas was the only sound he let fill his world. He held the ladder steady as Sierra worked, her focus so intense that she didn't. It seemed to notice him standing there, his eyes tracing her every movement. There was a grace to her, something fierce in the way she painted, but gentle at the same time. He couldn't help but admire how at peace she seemed, how alive she was in this element. It was a different version of her than the one he had first known, and this version was everything he had missed. The children who had spent the morning watching gathered around the mural, their small feet shuffling over the ground. Some of them held their artwork in their hands, colorful drawings inspired by the mural they had witnessed unfold before them. They weren't just spectators, they were participants in this quiet revolution. One child, perhaps no older than 8, tugged at Dorian's sleeve. "Why are you holding the ladder?" the kid asked, looking up at him with bright eyes. Dorian chuckled, a soft, genuine sound. "Because someone has to make sure the artist doesn't fall off." Sierra smiled down at them, catching Dorian's playful tone. "Sometimes," she said, "art is about lifting each other up, making space for people to stand tall, even when they're not sure how to." The child nodded seriously, then pointed at the mural. That one looks like me. Dorian's heart skipped, and he turned to look at the section the child was referencing. A small bird, its wings spread wide, was painted in vivid, warm colors, suspended in mid-flight. It was a perfect reflection of the child, standing in front of them, eyes wide, hope soaring in his gaze. "That's the beauty of it," Ciara said, her voice steady, filled with pride. "You see yourself in it. That's what art does. It helps us see who we really are." Dorian looked back at her, surprised at the tenderness in her words. She had always been someone who saw things differently, who believed in the quiet power of making space for others. He hadn't always understood it, but now, standing here with her, he did. The moment was fleeting, but it was enough to pull them back into the world they had tried to escape. As they worked, a few photographers appeared at the edge of the mural. At first, Dorian thought nothing of it, assuming they were just curious. But as the seconds passed, it became clear they weren't there for the children or the mural. They were there for the story. The clicks of their cameras filled the space between them, sharp and intrusive. The children began to scatter, their excitement giving way to confusion. Ciara stood still, her back to the wall, watching the scene unfold. She had worked so hard to keep this moment protected, to keep the focus on what really mattered, not the fame, not the publicity, but the art, the community, the connection. And now, it was slipping away from her. Dorian's gaze shifted from the photographers to the children, then to Ciara. She wasn't asking for the world to leave her alone. She was asking for respect, for space. He stepped forward, moving into the photographer's line of sight. His presence was commanding, but not forceful. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand anything. He simply stood there, a wall between the photographers and the children. "You don't need their pictures," he said, his voice firm but calm. "This is their space, not yours." The photographers hesitated, their cameras still raised but no longer clicking. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just the quiet authority of a man who had made his choice. Dorian wasn't here to fight the world. He was here to protect what mattered. One of the photographers spoke up, challenging him, but Dorian didn't budge. His gaze softened, but there was steel beneath it. "This isn't about you," he said quietly, "or about us. It's about them." The photographers exchanged glances, and finally they lowered their cameras. They didn't argue, didn't try to take the shot. They simply turned and walked away. Ciara watched from the scaffolding, her heart swelling in her chest. Dorian didn't need to win the fight. He didn't need to make a spectacle. He had simply protected what mattered. He had shown her, in that moment, exactly who he was. Without a word, Dorian took the brush she had left behind and rinsed it in the bucket of water. There was no victory lap. There was no congratulation, just a simple act of returning to the task at hand. The brush, washed clean, was handed back to her. "Let's finish it," he said softly. The unveiling ceremony was simple but full of warmth. The air was alive with music, laughter, and the smell of food. The community gathered together to see the finished mural. The children who had helped bring it to life were standing at the front, eyes wide with excitement. Their parents, friends, and neighbors filled the space around them, waiting for the moment when the mural would be revealed. Ciara and Dorian stood side by side, not at the front, but among the crowd. They weren't interested in being the center of attention. They were there for the community, for the people who had helped make it all possible. As the cloth was pulled away, the mural was revealed in all its glory. The birds flew high, their wings stretching across the wall. The river wound its way through the design, bringing together the threads that connected the community. The colors were vibrant, the symbols meaningful. The children saw themselves in it, and the adults saw the future they were building together. At the bottom right corner, where the brushstrokes had been the lightest, were the words, "For Mira and Kai." The names of their twins, a quiet declaration of love and belonging, were woven into the fabric of the community. They were there, in the wall, in the art, in the future. As the crowd murmured their appreciation, Ciara felt a surge of pride and peace. This wasn't just her work. It was their work. It was a symbol of what they had built and what they would continue to build together. As the crowd gathered around the mural, Dorian leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. It was a quiet, intimate moment, away from the noise of the world. "I love you," he whispered, his voice soft but steady, the words full of meaning. Tiara's heart fluttered, the words she had been waiting for finally spoken aloud. She didn't respond immediately. There were no fireworks, no grand declarations. It wasn't that kind of moment. Instead, she let the words wash over her, filling the space between them with the warmth of something steady, something real. "I love you too," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. It wasn't just a confession, it was a promise that had been forged in the quiet moments, in the shared decisions, in the love that had been built without the world watching. This was their love, not for the headlines, not for the applause, but for the life they had chosen to build together. If that choice hit you in the chest, send this to one person who needs a reminder. Love is a verb. They didn't win a war. They learned a rhythm. As the days drifted into weeks, Dorian and Ciara settled into the kind of routine that many would overlook but few could sustain. It was in the small acts, the moments that seemed insignificant to the outside world, where their love truly found its rhythm. Each morning, without fail, Ciara would take her vitamins, a quiet act of commitment to the life she was nurturing inside her. The twins, Mira and Kai, had become the center of their shared universe, a constant reminder of the responsibility they carried. It wasn't just about caring for them physically, it was about the steadiness. She had promised them, the world she had pledged to build, brick by brick. The first time Dorian saw her placing the vitamins on the kitchen counter, he had watched, wordlessly. She hadn't noticed him at first, so he took a moment to absorb the simplicity of it. It was a small gesture, a quiet promise to herself and to the twins. When she finally turned and saw him, her eyes soft with concern, he only nodded, acknowledging the depth of the commitment she was making every day. He wasn't as meticulous as Ciara, but he had his own quiet forms of heroism. Notes filled his wallet, small, handwritten scraps of thoughts, plans, and promises. They weren't business ideas or financial goals. They were pieces of their life together. A sketch of the mural, a list of things to do for the community center, a note to himself, "Remember, steady is enough." His notes weren't for anyone else. They weren't meant to be seen or shown off. They were reminders to himself, reminders to be the man he had promised to be. Sometimes his acts of heroism were even simpler. He took calls outside the house when things got too loud. He respected her need for peace, for space to think and breathe. When she would return from the community center, he would have dinner ready, no fanfare, no applause, just the quiet hum of their home, an oasis from the world outside. And when things went wrong, as they sometimes did, the apologies were quick, not rehearsed, not grand, just honest, raw, a moment of understanding that needed to be spoken. His words weren't wrapped in any specific formula. They were just the truth, said plainly. Tiara's forgiveness came just as quickly, steady, like the rhythm they were building together. It wasn't always easy, and they both knew that. But it was a choice, the choice to forgive, to move forward, to stay. Every relationship required boundaries, and Dorian and Ciara had learned to set their own, not out of fear or anger, but out of respect for each other and the space they needed to grow. The world was still curious about them, especially now that the mural had become a symbol of something bigger than either of them. There were whispers, there were eyes, but together they stepped aside when the curiosity of the world pressed too hard. They didn't feed it. They didn't engage with it. They chose silence over spectacle. They chose peace over publicity. But it wasn't just about shutting the world out. It was about choosing each other every single day. They had come to realize that when the world demanded something from them, they had the right to say no. They had the right to protect what mattered. They chose the team over winning. Their love was not a competition. Their choices weren't about outshining anyone else, about being the center of attention. They were about choosing each other, steady, calm, true. They had learned, above all, that slow and honest was the foundation of everything. They didn't need to rush through life. They didn't need grand gestures or to live for the world's approval. What mattered was their quiet rhythm, the small moments, the everyday choices, Slow and honest, Tiara would say sometimes, her voice soft but full of meaning. And Dorian would smile, nodding. They had learned the importance of those words, of how much they meant in their lives. It was a lazy afternoon, one of those golden hours where the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the world in a warm glow. Dorian and Ciara walked along the beach, the waves lazily curling around their feet. The sound of the ocean was a soothing lullaby, the soft rush of the water a reminder that the world was still turning, that time was still moving, even if it felt like everything had paused for them. They didn't talk much. Sometimes words weren't necessary. They let the silence speak for them, the quiet companionship more than enough. Dorian had his arm slung casually around Ciara's shoulders as they walked, their steps syncing in an unspoken rhythm. The world around them seemed distant, muted. It was just them, the beach, and the quiet understanding that came with being together. Ciara stopped for a moment, her hand trailing through the sand. She bent down and picked up a small piece of driftwood, turning it over in her hands. "Sometimes I think about forgetting everything," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "The world, the pressure. Everything that pulls us away from what matters." Dorian stopped beside her, looking out at the horizon. "What do you mean?" "I mean, sometimes I think it would be easier if we just left it all behind. If we just lived here, quietly, we could forget all of it," she said, her voice soft with the weight of her thoughts. Dorian took a step closer to her, his hand finding hers, their fingers intertwining. He didn't speak for a long moment, just stood there beside her, the sound of the waves crashing in the distance. "We'll forget some things," he said finally, his voice steady. "But we'll remember too. We'll remember the things that matter, the moments, the choices we made." Ciara looked at him, her heart swelling with the depth of his words. She squeezed his hand, nodding. "To remember," she said quietly, lifting her eyes to meet him. "Tamira and Kai," Dorian added, his voice thick with emotion. They both looked down at her belly, at the life they were bringing into, the world, a symbol of their love, their steady commitment to each other. It was in that moment, with the sun setting behind them, that Ciara knew they had found something. It wasn't a perfect story, it wasn't an easy journey, but it was theirs. And it was enough. The flight back was smoother than the first, the hum of the plane a steady background to their quiet moment. The world outside was calm, the sky clear and open, but inside the cabin it felt different. There was no tension now, no uncertainty. There was peace. Ciara leaned her head against Dorian's shoulder, the weight of the day finally sinking in. The twins fluttered inside her, their small movements like a quiet agreement. Between them, a reminder of the life they had chosen together. Dorian's hand rested on hers, a gentle touch that conveyed everything he didn't need to say. His presence was a comfort, steady and sure, just as it had always been. And as Ciara closed her eyes for a moment, she knew deep down that they were ready for whatever came next. They had come so far, had built a life together, out of the quiet moments and the steady choices. There was nothing grand or dramatic about it, but that was what made it beautiful. They had chosen each other day after day, through the small things, through the hard moments, through the turbulence. And that was enough. Their journey had taught them so much about love, about relationships, and about life. These weren't lessons they had read in books or heard from others. They were lessons they had learned the hard way, through their own mistakes and growth. Tell the hard truth sooner. It's the door to freedom. This was the hardest lesson they had learned. The longer they had kept their secrets, the harder it had become to move forward. But when they finally spoke the truth, when they finally laid it all bare, they were free. Free to love. Free to be who they were meant to be. Pride protects image. Humility protects the relationship. They both had worn their pride like armor, but they had come to realize that pride wasn't what kept them together. Humility did. The ability to apologize, to admit when they were wrong, to listen, these were the things that protected their bond. Love isn't grand promises, it's steady, everyday choices. Their love had never been about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It had been about the small moments, the everyday choices that built trust, respect, and love. It was about choosing each other, again and again, without expectation, without need for validation from the world. To the first 600 plus of Mr. Steele Rich stories, thank you. If this story gave you something, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me your biggest takeaway in the comments. And if you're rocking with us, comment 600 strong, so I can find you. Share this with someone who needs slow and honest love today.